Hi, everyone. Jessica Morales joining you now with Mr. Tom Petrie, Chairman, Petrie Partners. I also have my colleagues Steve Toon and Jennifer Presley joining us.
Will such a price shock actually serve to rebalance markets, Tom, by eliminating high-cost production? Is there, a silver lining in all of this?
Yeah, there is to some degree, but we've got better visibility on the U.S. than we have on the whole Earth, the global picture. And I've heard people assert something in the 500 to 700,000 barrel a day range for high cost stripper wells, for example. And so some of that will be shut in because it can be restarted when prices are acceptable. But at this point, usually the people that own that are going to have trouble getting it to market anyway, and so they will be shutting some of that down. We're the most developed country in the world because of the history of it. So I don't know that there's quite the equivalent of that elsewhere. There are other reasons why high cost production is going to have difficulty. Canadian production, for example, getting the medium and heavy oil in Canada to the relevant market, which right now is the Gulf Coast. We spent $85 billion upgrading our refineries to run heavier oil. In general, we're short heavier oil in the Gulf Coast because hauling it all the way from Saudi Arabia, from Iraq, and elsewhere in the Middle East has diminished anyway. And frankly, the tendency to want to use ships for storage because it's so tight elsewhere. I think there is some high cost oil that will be part of the self-correcting mechanism that's been triggered.
Okay, so Tom, a follow-up to that. How do you foresee the U.S. oil and gas landscape? What will that look like on the other side of this, Tom?
Well, even before this all happened, there was a sense, and a widening sense, a broadening sense, that M&A consolidation was overdue. One of the things that in our system, when we see opportunity, the ability of the financial system to fund generously and then ultimately overfund good ideas is there. And so we've had a big expansion in the ability of independents to get capital. Initially, they got equity capital because people saw the Oklahoma land rush aspects of the shale revolution. And then for those who captured acreage, then various bond options opened up involving high yield finance. And so right now, there's $110 billion of that kind of high yield financing out there that'll come due in the next 3 to 5 years, and some of the companies, that situation was okay at $50 or $55, at $20 and less, and even at a recovered $25, $30, $35, that's going to be a challenge. So I see an M&A consolidation that's coming. And it'll be coming partly because of what they call liability management, which is a euphemism for, restructuring the right-hand side of the balance sheet.
This, I guess my question is more along the lines of just OPEC in general. That much has changed in the 60 years or so since its establishment. In your opinion, how well has it kept up with the changing times? Certainly, we've all been disrupted with, the past 6 weeks or so. Is there an opportunity there to look at OPEC and tweak it or, make changes to it? Is there room for a representative, if you will, of the independent oil and gas, producers? Is there room for someone like that at OPEC's table? Or does OPEC just, not interested in hearing the independent side?
Well, I think OPEC's way of functioning is changing. This is, for most of the members of OPEC, this is their most important item to sell in the international markets. And so that's why they've opted for the cartel arrangement. But they've shown that even as a cartel, they're not omnipotent, and they do have to recognize market reality. They've gotten better and better at that over the 5 decades that we're now dealing with. And so I think they've become a reasonably functional organization, but the way they function now is challenged, and it used to be the case, but it's much more the case today, that there's the haves and have-nots within OPEC, or the healthy OPEC players and those who are less healthy. And so I think they're going to, how well they stand the test of the year 2020 will probably define how it will function as an organization in the balance of this decade. And clearly, OPEC has always needed leadership. Traditionally, that's come from Saudi Arabia. And now, because there are 2 other claimants to being the largest producer and exporter in the world, the leadership involves also Russia, and to some degree, dialogue with the U.S. I don't see it as dialogue with it. I don't think there's a role for the independents, because even the biggest independents, in most cases, are not bigger than the smaller OPEC members. There might be an exception or 2 to that, but very few. And for North American independents that are incorporated in either the US or Canada, there are legal constraints on their being part of a cartel in its function. But I do think there's going to be a better dialogue. And really what we're going through now is really fostering a better dialogue with OPEC in order that everybody's needs for a workable price needs to be, they need to at least improve the odds of the market functioning to reward the pricing for participants. You know, in my judgment, I think that says we don't get back to $100 oil for a very long time, but it does say the excursion from a $55 to $65 price down to a sub-20 price is so extreme that there are no winners. This is not a win-win. This is a lose-lose-lose. It's a losing proposition for OPEC. It's a losing proposition for the rest of the industry that's not part of OPEC. And it's clearly a losing proposition longer term for consuming nations, because the constraints that we're now dealing with will ultimately kick in terms of supply shortages that are in nobody's interest. And so I think there's going to be a workable dialogue that will develop. And I think the ingredients for that are already in place.
You know, this is not the first go round of this. Back in, 2014, we had the Thanksgiving surprise. Prices dropped, they came back up, and then they plummeted again. And I think it was February of 16. And then following that, OPEC and Russia created the OPEC Plus agreement that has been in place until just recently. So right. My premise is this, Tom, notwithstanding the effects on demand from coronavirus, was a price collapse inevitable? Was the price of oil over these past 3 or 4 years falsely propped up or unnaturally propped up by that agreement? Was it destined to end anyhow?
It was, but not in quite the dramatic fashion that we're experiencing at the moment. I think there was. I think there's a price distribution chart that I have, and I think I used it in maybe one of the last conference or so, where I showed the price distribution for each of those years. 13, I did it for 13, and then 14, and then I took out 15 just because it was part of the path to 16 where we made the lows. And what we learned during that period was, as soon as we get to the low, and the low, as I recall, was in the spring of 16, the agreement went in, as you mentioned, with OPEC Plus in February, And by April or May, we made the low in WTI at $26.40, at least in the commodity market. That's what it was. And then we had a good recovery back into the 50s. And but then in 18, we had enough recovery where we got up to a price that at the low end it was 58, and at the high end it was something like 77. And we began to think about $80 oil. And what we were defining was, you know, what is sustainable in a world economy where at that time President Trump was hammering the Chinese with successive increases in tariffs. And that was beginning to induce concern about what the long-term global economic growth rate was going to be, because that's the primary driver of long-term oil demand. So you're right, you're onto it. And basically, we've now got lots of reasons to ponder and not be able to adequately define what the new normal will be in long-term economic growth.
For more Hart Energy videos, follow our social media channels.